So I'm just going to start off and give just a real brief backgrounder of who I am. As I said, my name is Chanel Summers. I think we look alike. And I've worked for most of my professional career in the video games industry, focusing primarily in the area of interactive audio for digital media. However, I actually started off my career as a game designer and a producer at some very early innovating companies, including Microsoft, where I shipped their first ever massively multiplayer game, Fighter Ace, before moving on to the Windows and DirectX side of the house and working on the DirectX audio technologies. I then became a member of the original Xbox team, and I helped to design the audio system for that groundbreaking console and go on to create the first ever support team for content creators aimed at sound designers, composers, game designers, and graphic artists to really help them in taking full advantage of Xbox's capabilities. But then I wanted to take my knowledge and experience of dynamic adaptive audio and sound design and music composition and songwriting and create and produce audio projects for myself. So after I left Microsoft, I worked on more direct applications of audio, first as a recording and touring drummer, and then at my own company, Syndicate 17. So now I own and run my own audio production company, lecture and teach the art of video game audio at the University of Southern California's Interactive Media and Games Division, as well as at a number of other prestigious universities, conferences, and industry events all over the world, and consult for a variety of innovative technology companies. Now, let's get started. Let's talk about the cool stuff. Now, to me, and hopefully to all of you, one of the most exciting things about video games is that they really represent this brand new way of interacting with an audience, with the potential to do so in a much more meaningful and much more intimate way than any medium has been able to do thus far. Now, as such, I believe that video games and game audio in particular should aspire to far greater artistic goals than any other medium. But unfortunately, game audio still trails other art forms when it comes to artistic expression. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is aesthetics. What does it mean to have aesthetic or artistic audio? Why haven't we seen aesthetic innovation in the audio within video games in the same way that we have with graphics or gameplay? And how can we employ aesthetic principles to push audio and games themselves forward in a much more emotionally impactful way? Now, in order to answer those questions, we're going to look not to examples from games, but rather examples of techniques that other media, particularly film, have used to create more aesthetic auditory experiences, asking how we might apply these to game audio design. Because as you'll see, I believe that audio has the ability to affect people on an even deeper level than you might expect, perhaps even a subliminal level that the audience isn't even aware of. And as you'll also see, I believe that video game audio hasn't even begun to scratch the surface of what's possible artistically. Now, there is no question that over the past decade or two, game audio has really taken these huge evolutionary leaps forward when measured by quality of execution and advancements in technology, from the days of sound chip-generated bleeps and bloops and simple musical melodies to really take advantage of today's modern gaming systems. We have the ability to play sounds anywhere in 3D space, and composers are recording epic scores with live large orchestras at sample rates comparable to film sound. There's also high-quality sound libraries and synthesis tools available to those who can't afford to hire a full orchestra. Amazing orchestral and instrumental samples or virtual instruments with tons of articulations modeled. And games are also supporting surround sound technologies, 5.1, 7.1. We're even looking at a commercialized form of Atmos. And we also have a treasure trove of game-specific audio tools, technologies, and techniques. Dynamic real-time mixing, real-time DSP parameter control, adaptive and variable audio, and procedural audio. But despite all these cool technical advancements and all this really cool sounding stuff, and it really is cool stuff, I would argue that we haven't begun to scratch the surface artistically. So game audio is technically as well executed as a feature film. But are we using these fantastic tools to create works of art with our audio? I would argue that with only a few exceptions, the answer is no. Now, how can I say that? How do we know that game audio is falling short of achieving its potential to rise to the level of art? And perhaps even more importantly, can game audio ever really be considered art? Should game audio even aspire to being art? Well, game audio can and should aspire to delivering more impactful experiences than any other medium that's come before. Like any creative endeavor, the audio within a game can of course be art, or it cannot be art. So how do we tell the difference? How do we know when we've produced art? Well, first of all, the mark of a superior sound design, like many art forms, whether that be painting or sculpture or theater or cinema, is one that you don't consciously notice. It works on a person's subconscious, playing with silence and subtlety and tension, manipulating the mood and drawing the player into the game world. It takes advantage of the basic elements of audio aesthetics and utilizes devices such as ambiguity, juxtaposition, counterfunctional sounds, and misdirection. Artistic audio is audio that can be used to craft the story elements of a game, control the pacing of the gameplay, enforce the game narrative, elicit and influence emotion, create mood, shape perception, and reinforce the way people experience game characters. And it's audio that continually reinforces and enhances all other elements of the game, building this complete immersive player experience, which is more than the sum of its parts. Now, games and game audio have a potential to aspire to the highest level of art. But by not even attempting to give an audience a deeper and more captivating experience, they'll never evolve in the same way that other media have and made the same kind of impact on the world that other media have. Even comic books transcended their origins when that industry began creating graphic novels that coexist today with more transient titles like in Archie Comics. Now, from my perspective, at the heart of this issue is an ongoing debate over functionality versus aesthetics. In many games, the audio is purely functional. It does the job that it was intended to, supporting and facilitating gameplay. And as a result, the emotional and psychological functions of sound that would cause the game's audio to rise to the level of art are often sacrificed in the name of utility. So as a result, games are one of the few media left that don't aspire to aesthetic impact in all aspects of its creation. Every creative endeavor should have some sort of an aesthetic to it, in my opinion, or else you miss out on some of the most exciting opportunities to really impact the player and create an incredibly compelling experience. Look at the effort that is expended by production designers, costume designers, hair and makeup people on films both large and small. Every detail is scrutinized. Every choice has an artistic meaning behind it. But because games are a non-linear form of media, I think that we have the tendency to hide behind our own unique dilemma. How to incorporate expressiveness with interactivity? How do you make sound that is both responsive to user interaction, but also emotionally impactful? Why even try? Now, since film is a linear medium, the timing and progression are known and beforehand, and therefore sound can be tailored with precision. But in a game, the player controls the action, and the player determines what will happen. Therefore, emotional moments arise as a result of user actions. Now, it is definitely true that one of the most unique challenges that we face is how to engineer and manipulate a meaningful and dynamic emotional state while remaining flexible enough to follow where the user chooses to take the action. But many of us use this as an excuse for delivering audio that's merely functional, arguing that you can't create art when the audience is in control. Well, are they right? Well, the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright was asked about one of the guiding principles of modern architecture and industrial design, the notion that form should follow function. This is the cornerstone, the foundation of 20th century architecture. And it was Wright's opinion that form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. And I assert that the same holds true of game audio. Why is it a choice? You can have both form and function. You should have both form and function. And this is something that game creators need to figure out. And they can. But how? By looking at the success that other creative art forms have had over the millennia and adapting it to our own unique opportunities. Now, in order to progress, I believe that game audio will finally start to take cues from other aesthetic points of reference, such as film, theater, opera, performance art, musique concrète, etc., while finding its own unique identity derived from the fact that in a game, unlike those other art forms, events rarely unfold the same way every time the game is played and replayed. Artists working in these other media have already struggled successfully with the challenge and opportunity afforded by a multitude of technologies and techniques. They've already solved the hard creative problems, and they've already achieved art in their creative endeavors. Employing proper aesthetic principles to drive the latest game audio-specific tools, technologies, and techniques will enable game creators to push audio and games themselves forward in an emotionally impactful way. Now, one of the best places to start when trying to understand the ability of sound to tell a story and become an artistic element is with an example from the master himself, Orson Welles. Now, although few people realized it at the time, the film industry reached a turning point artistically in 1941, barely more than a decade after the release of the very first motion picture with sound, when Orson Welles created his masterpiece, Citizen Kane. Now, much has been said and written about the transformational advancements in cinematography and set design and editing that Welles pioneered in that film. But it should come as no surprise, given his distinguished background in radio, that he also changed the perception of cinema sound forever with that same film. Now, the power of radio is that it communicates all its rich storytelling exclusively through the use of sound. And this medium really allowed Welles to hone his craft and perfect many of his storytelling techniques by relying on the listener's imagination. He took the limitations of radio and he turned them into advantages. And then he took the storytelling devices he learned and used in radio, and on the stage before that, to film. He distorted sound to convey where the characters were relative to the listener. He faded volume to suggest distance. He added echoes to imply space. And he was the first to use filters to imply an interior monologue. These are all techniques that we take for granted today in all forms of recorded media. Welles' most famous radio broadcast, War of the Worlds, utilized the power of radio to the utmost by tapping into the subconscious fears of a nation and convincing millions that Martians were invading the US. And he made this invasion seem real to people by giving the broadcast an unrehearsed or unscripted feel and employing devices such as dead air, intentional mistakes in the dialogue, and moments of chaos and disorder. But where Welles really refined those techniques was in the medium of film. And the true genius of Citizen Kane is Welles' ability to combine his audio techniques from radio with a brand new visual storytelling language. In particular, Welles uses sound to expand on the meaning on that which is seen on screen. So let's now take a look at a scene from Citizen Kane when a reporter goes to review a manuscript written by one of Kane's closest confidants.
The directors of the Thatcher Memorial Library have asked me to remind you again, Mr. Thompson, of the conditions under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoirs. Yes, James. I bring him right in.
All I want
under
now
no circumstances are direct quotations from his manuscript to be used by you.
Well, that's all right. I'm just looking for one.
Thank you, James. Mr. Thompson, you will be required to leave this room at 4:30 promptly. You will confine yourself, it is our understanding, to the chapters in Mr. Thatcher's manuscript regarding Mr. Kane.
That's all I'm interested in. Thank you.
Pages 83 to 142.
Now, as you may have noticed in that scene, the sound is highly distorted through the use of echo. And Wells's choice to use processed sound was driven not solely by a need to convey the reality of the fact that the scene is taking place in a large marble library. It's also meant to add narrative information above and beyond the visuals, that we're essentially in this tomb erected to the memory of a man who's as cold in death as he was in life. And in fact, I would argue that Wells may well have set the scene in a large empty hall precisely so that he could have artistic permission to mirror the empty, echoey sound of a mausoleum. And it is possible, and even likely, that the sound design informed the art direction and not the other way around, in order to achieve an artistic effect and make a subliminal impact on the audience to advance an unexpressed concept. And that's art. But, speaking of art, I would argue that the greatest lesson that the game industry can learn from practically any other medium about how to elevate audio to the level of art is the concept of ambiguity. Now, in video games, and frankly in most films, unless they're art films, sound usually does act as a vehicle for game creators to project their own interpretation of their game in such a way that it cannot be easily misinterpreted by an audience. So ambiguity is the idea that works of art are open to multiple meanings or interpretation. And the best works of art, whether they're films or paintings or pieces of music or stage plays or novels or whatever, is that they create this relatively large canvas on which the audience can, or in some cases must, fill in many of the details themselves through interpretation. Now, these creative endeavors require the audience to make certain very personal assumptions about the work they're experiencing, based on their own past experiences and memories, triggering associations that the artist could never have foreseen. Now, a few years ago, I was asked by a client to create an effect that sounded orange. And to me, this seemed like the most ludicrous request, and the product of a client that I felt couldn't express themselves eloquently, so that they needed to resort to this, what I thought, a ridiculous analogy, as they weren't able to give me the clear and specific creative direction that I was so craving. And for some time after finishing this project, I laughed about this request with some of my colleagues in the industry. But over time, as I matured, I've come to realize that this sort of creative direction can be a very good thing, because it forces the artist to make associations that they otherwise wouldn't if focused on the superficial. It forced me to think about the sound design in terms of feelings and emotions versus just acoustic properties. And in fact, because of that happening to me, I devised an exercise and project for my class at USC called the Mystery and Danger exercise. And what this is an analysis and articulation of an emotion or feeling using sound design properties. Now, the first part of the exercise consists of writing up a detailed analysis from your subjective perspective what mystery and danger would sound like. Meaning, if a client asked you to create a sound design based on the words mystery and danger, what would you do? What does that mean to you? How would you approach it? What would your process be? And then the second part is to create that soundscape. So let me play you an example of one of my students' interpretation of mystery and danger. And feel free to close your eyes if you want to. I think they did a pretty good job. Incidentally, when I went and I ran a workshop at Dublin Institute of Technology, and it was with a predominantly male class, and they were all really excited about the mystery and danger exercise. And I said, no, I'm going to switch the words up on you. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yes, your words are love and romance. And they're like, no! But they did actually a fantastic job, really heartfelt, emotional, and personal pieces. They swore me to secrecy about that, not to play it, because they really kind of poured themselves into it, but they did an amazing job. Now, conversely, ambiguous sound can also be used to create frustration or even fear in the audience by presenting sound that is unfamiliar or unintelligible. And a great example of ambiguous sound is a scene from French comic filmmaker Jacques Tati's landmark film, Mon Oncle, in which the audio track is comprised entirely of sound effects that correspond to the on-screen action. But the sounds are not what we expect to hear in reality. Madame Marpel's footsteps are those of a horse cantering, whereas Monsieur Marpel's resemble the clinking of his teacup. The rustling of Madame Marpel's dress is prominent, perhaps even quite dominant in the scene. And Monsieur Marpel's vocalization is completely inaudible. Let's take a look. I like the dog in the sweater. Now, there are many, many ways to interpret the audio choices in this scene. The absurdity of their ideal suburban life, the dysfunction of their relationship, the silliness of their traditional gender roles, perhaps even a statement by Tati himself on the nature of filmmaking. But regardless, though, combining images with sound that initially seems to be out of context or against expectations creates this metaphor that of necessity requires the audience to search for their own personal interpretation. In this case, by juxtaposing the wrong sounds against the visuals, the viewer is forced to interpret what they're seeing and hearing in order to try and make sense of something that is ultimately nonsensical. And Tati even uses silence or the suspension of sound at key moments in order to emphasize certain sounds and underscore the comedic or ridiculous nature of the corresponding on-screen actions. Now, later on in my talk, I'm going to discuss ambiguity's twin sibling, subtlety. And I would argue that subtlety, more than anything, is what defines great art. The ability to convey a lot of information in a controlled fashion defines the great artist in any medium. So what did all the previous examples have in common? Well, when film sound rises to the level of art, the sound enhances the underlying meaning of the experience in a very personal way. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum, completely detached from the rest of the project. It contributes to a deeper meaning within the film. So we need to start thinking beyond the notion that sounds are just these assets that correspond to actions we see on screen. We need to think beyond the surface meaning of the sounds. But then we also need to be vigilant about going in the opposite direction and creating bad art. Audio that's too busy, audio that's too abstract, audio that's too overbearing. So let's explore some approaches and suggestions that I believe can help establish a mindset that will inform new processes and new procedures. And I'm suggesting things to think about in order to really encourage a fresh approach to game sound design, or indeed sound in any other creative media for that matter, that's inspired by painting and radio and film and theater and the underlying notions of psychology that have been so effectively used by those art forms. Now, please also be aware that I'm not introducing any of these concepts today for the first time anywhere. In fact, many of them have been explored to some extent by game makers, but usually only in a very basic or underdeveloped way. The risk of doing so, though, is that these techniques then come across quite ham-fisted, cheap, and gimmicky. Now, to truly affect an audience through sound, we must first understand how the audience perceives sound and then exploit the psychology of that. Sound is this immensely powerful narrative device. And one of the powerful things about sound is that it can imply actions or items not possible through graphics. And it affects our perception of game events on an even deeper level than graphics, story, or character. Audio plays a crucial role in our emotional lives and alters our perceptions, affecting us on this deep emotional level because we're continually experiencing it. Unlike our eyes, the ears never blink. And in fact, studies have shown that when we associate an image with a sound that's played concurrently, it's the sound that dominates our response, even to the point of overruling our eyes and leading both the emotional and physiological response to the event. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you a demo of this when I talk about the concept of forced marriage. Now, one of the most effective and simplest ways to manipulate an audience's psychological reaction to sound is to alter their subjective perception of that sound. And subjective listening is a technique that can really intensify the narrative qualities of a game by playing sounds from the perspective of the character, rather than trying to render the environment that we, the player, are seeing on screen. Now, essentially, we hear what the protagonist hears, if it's real or imagined, which means that we can get access to their internal mental state, and we hear things as the character interprets them. This can include auditory hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. This can include perceptual distortions, internal voices, or character memories brought on by stress, trauma, or even through the ingestion of mind-altering substances. The subjective perception of sound can be an extremely powerful and unique tool in approaching sound design because it actually takes us into the mind of the protagonist and we experience the audio the way he or she does. Now, obviously, when we play a first-person perspective game, we are the character and we hear sounds from their point of view. However, what I'm talking about here is something that's very rarely considered: the psychological processes of the character's mental state and how it affects what they're hearing. So imagine a game presented from the perspective of the main character where sound is affected and distorted by the character's mental state, whether they're excited, depressed, full of rage, maybe having some kind of psychotic breakdown. Now let's take a look at a scene from the movie Pi, directed by Darren Aronofsky, for an amazing demonstration of subjective perception. Now, the main character in Pi is a math genius, and he believes that everything can be boiled down to and be made understandable by numbers. He also perceives that everything is comprised of patterns. But he also suffers from very painful and devastating hallucinations and headaches. And in this scene, we're going to experience one of his episodes through a combination of low-throbbing sounds and then a barrage of grating frequencies, coupled with the low thump of his hand striking his head to make the pain go away. Now, ultimately, we experience what he's feeling in a way that would not be possible through description or dialogue. Now imagine watching that scene and being in a theater with like an amazing surround sound setup. You would totally have like a very, very painful headache. And I believe this technique really does lead us to a deeper sense of who the character is. And it builds a stronger connection to that character by allowing us to really identify with the character on a deeper level, making for a much more immersive and much more visceral experience. Now, the easiest way to build on that subjective perception of audio is through the use of acousmatic audio, which is just really a fancy way of describing a sound or sounds whose source is not visible intentionally. Since we cannot see the source or cause of the sound, this can create a sense of mystery and apprehension. And it's a great way to communicate messages, meaning, pacing, and mood in a non-visual way. Think of the mother in Psycho or the wizard in Wizard of Oz. These powerful characters are introduced initially entirely through sound.
I am Oz, the great and powerful. Who are you?
Now we hear them long before we ever see them. And then when we do see them, they are reduced significantly in stature. We've been tricked by the audio, and the trick is revealed by the image. And also, acousmatic audio is a fantastic way to create ambiguity. As we've already just discussed, known sounds can force the audience to recall memories and experiences, while unknown sounds can create confusion and possibly fear. Here's a great example from the classic movie Evil Dead 2. Notice you never see the demon, you just hear him or her. It's a great scene. Now, acousmatic audio is obviously a technique that has been used in a number of games sort of by default, because you obviously never see absolutely everything that's generating the sounds you hear in a game. But the trick is to manipulate the off-screen sounds intentionally. For example, to maintain that suspense or preserve that mystery. So when we hear a sound without seeing its source, we're then forced to interpret what we're hearing, perhaps even subconsciously. Is that a baby crying? Is there a storm brewing outside? Are there giant robots walking by? In this way, acousmatic audio can communicate meaning and metaphor, or even game elements that do not exist visually. Wooden signs banging against buildings in an abandoned, windy town might suggest that a previous horrific event took place. Or a person crying or whimpering in the distance might suggest suffering and vulnerability. Now, taking this a step further, we can play on the audience's subjective experience of game audio by considering their expectations and then delivering the opposite. Michel Chion, a French film theorist and an innovator in the field of experimental music and author of Audio Vision, or l'Audiovisuel, but my French is so terrible I hate pronouncing it, is considered to be, by most critics, the definitive book on the relationship between sound and images. And he proposed the idea that there's two ways that sound can evoke a specific emotion based on what the audience sees on screen. Empathetic sound is sound where the mood matches the mood of the action, reinforcing the visuals with complementary rhythms and tones. This is the case for the audio we hear in almost all games, and most films for that matter. However, occasionally artists employ anempathetic sound by delivering audio that is the opposite of what is expected, which affects the audience on a much more profound level by hinting at a deeper meaning beneath the surface of the on-screen action. And anempathetic sound can even be overtly tragic by subconsciously informing us that what we might expect to transpire in a film or game's plot will not come to pass. And in this way, audio that doesn't reflect the actions on screen or the character's emotions can now create a sense of irony. Now, in an extreme example of anempathetic sound, Schoen proposed a really cool sound image experiment called forced marriage, which involves pairing a relatively neutral visual film sequence with completely different soundtracks, both sound effects and music, in order to experience the very different relationships that develop in the mind of the audience. Now, Schoen pointed out that there will always be a few that create amazing points of synchronization and moving or comical juxtapositions, which always come as a surprise. And in recent years, a number of very clever editors have shown off their skills on YouTube by recutting trailers for classic films in a style that's completely different from the film itself, starting with this trailer for the psycho thriller, Scary Mary.
Stay away, don't rest your head, don't lie down upon your bed.
Hide your children. There's a ton of these on the internet, so you should check them out. There's ones where if like Disney made Jaws, and now like Jaws is this wonderful singing shark that everybody loves, and 10 Commandments I Hate About You, and ones where they take, another classic one is they take Shining and they turn it into a romantic comedy. So check all that out, because it's pretty cool stuff. Now, one of the most fundamental and I believe most underutilized aspects of clever and mature sound design is the ability to use silence, or near silence, as you would any other sound in your game. Silence can really draw our attention to particular sonic details. It can enhance dramatic moments, and it can contribute to the overall narrative structure or stylistic approach of a medium. You can use it to help amplify emotion. You can use it to focus a player's attention. But it's important to understand how to utilize and choreograph tension and release to create your own narrative, whether in support of or in opposition to the visuals. Now, the loudest, most spectacular sequences in a film are almost always made even larger by the silence that comes before and after. So well-placed silence and subtlety allow the larger-than-life parts of a game to be perceived as even more powerful, thanks to the contrast between those loud parts and the surrounding areas of silence. Now, as a result, the clever use of silence can potentially have a greater impact on the viewer or the player than the biggest and loudest sounds. And in this scene from another Darren Aronofsky film, The Fountain, Hugh Jackman's character runs from this hospital immediately after he learns that his wife has succumbed to cancer. And he runs onto the busy streets of New York City. Now, grief-stricken, Jackman's character is focused entirely on his pain, while the world around him is silent. Only after a few moments is he jolted back to reality by the screeching tires of a car that nearly runs him over. More impactful and meaningful. So let's wrap up by looking at an example of putting these theories into practice with a pretty exciting case study, at least I think so. Now, in November of 2013, I was approached by a gentleman named Alex McDowell. And Alex is a BAFTA-nominated production designer responsible for such cinematic classics as Fight Club, Minority Report, Man of Steel, many others. And he had been tapped by Intel to create this groundbreaking demo that would showcase the capabilities of their new ultra-powerful tablet chipsets at the Consumer Electronics Show. And he needed a very expressive sound design. The subject of Alex's demo would be this interactive adaptation of Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan novels, which are set in this very rich steampunk world that reimagines World War I with mechanized war machines and genetically enhanced creature-based combat. There's Leviathan, the whale ship. Now, Alex at Intel had this vision for an immersive world in which audiences would be able to engage and physically explore a fictionally, digitally constructed environment. And my team and I, we needed to bring this rich world to life through sound, creating an audio design, a musical score, and a mix that would be featured not only on Intel's stand at the show, but also in a keynote speech to be delivered by Intel's CEO. And the keynote would be presented live in front of 5,000 dignitaries. And the longer demo in the booth would actually allow visitors to interact with the characters through advanced augmented reality techniques. And we had to actually create this full audioscape for this very ambitious and large-scale project with an extremely tight schedule, and therefore developed a very successful iterative and collaborative audio approach. We also did a lot of work with the manipulation of frequencies in order to communicate emotions and feelings within a noisy trade show environment. So let's watch as the giant whale, the Leviathan, swims above an audience of 5,000, all reaching out to touch this virtual creature overhead in real time from an excerpt of Intel's CES keynote.
Storytelling is taking on an amazing form. No longer limited to a flat book, a flat screen. With the right technology that we can enable, we can be immersed in this story. Some of you may know Scott Westerfeld's book, Leviathan. Leviathan is the story of a whale airship. Up until now, you've been, at best, engaged in that story. So that's great. But what if we could do more? What if we could bring the digital world into our world? Imagine Leviathan could be here in this room with us tonight, flying just above your heads. Wouldn't you want to reach out and touch it, wave to it, see it from every angle? Remember, I told you this was an immersive event tonight. Tonight, I don't want you to merely imagine a flying whale. I want you to experience it. Sight, sound, all of it.
as you just saw, the demo starts out as a traditional cinematic experience, but then quickly and surprisingly transitions to an augmented reality mode, where an audience member can pick up a tablet, point it at the screen, and see the whale fly out of the traditional cinematic two-dimensional screen into the audience space itself. So every time you build out the world, you also create the space for more story. And in a little bit, we'll see if we can coax the whale to come out and visit us here. Now, to accomplish this in such a short amount of time, within a fixed budget, I was brought onto the project as the audio director, and I worked with a student-based team. I then hired a composer in Ireland to create the musical score. The first step was to conceptualize the various sounds that would comprise the world of Leviathan. And in the longer demo, we introduced the Huxleys, which are a swarm of small octopus or jellyfish-like creatures that would get released by the whale that the audience could actually interact with, like virtual pets. And these cute, humorous characters needed a range of sounds that could enable them to come alive. Let's bring a Huxley out here right now. Hopefully my sound driver's removed. We'll see. Yeah, we have to bring this one higher. Volume higher. Yeah. Backwards.
I think the audio driver isn't working.
There we go. Hi, Huxley. Yes. This is So I made him dizzy. All right, bye for now. Switch back. Oh, come on.
You got this.
Yes. So the Huxley sounds came about through a process of what's called sound concepting, or sonic storyboards, and creative direction and collaboration through the concept of ambiguity. This was a really highly iterative process that kind of involved sharing assets back and forth between the entire audio team as well as the greater creative team. And in order to become successful, I first had to become the Huxley. I had to immerse myself into what I thought might be the Huxley sounds. And this involved working mostly through emotive qualities and feelings and less on actual acoustic properties. And Huxleys really needed to strike the right balance between dangerous and cute. They can make adorable squeaky sounds, but they can also convey an undercurrent of danger. Now you see, Huxleys are playful and they want to engage you, and they hardly seem dangerous at all. But strictly narratively speaking, Huxleys are gatherers of electricity, and one of their functions is to fly into lightning storms, get charges, and bring them back home. So if you touch one in real life, it would probably electrocute you. And taking this all into account, that's why we made some kind of fizzle and hum noise underneath everything, which would then be underscored by a visual glow and perhaps a charge reaction when you touch them on screen. So our first task was really to create the baseline Huxley voice and then work on their personality. And when we talked to the creative team, they kind of described them as baby animals and shy kittens. And in fact, the team would speak in high pitches when thinking about them. So we created these rough early sound concepts that stemmed from my vocalizations in order to give the team some options when deciding on the direction for how the Huxleys should sound in their minds. Now, we also used the sound of these birds I heard in Dallas, Texas, called the great-tailed grackle. And we used those also to flesh out the Huxley sound palette. Now, hopefully my driver switched over. I'll let you... No, they did not.
Is there a way to test that?
It's just got to do... Oh, you know what? That would do it. It's a simple thing. He's right. Okay. We already hear that. So we combined those sounds with actually me going, brought those into our, to our DAWs, to our digital audio workstations, and then started to process and blend those sounds together and voila, create the Huxley sounds. And we had learned also at this time that we had to keep these sounds in a higher frequency register as they'd be coming out of the tablet speakers and they would need to cut through the noise of the conference. People would not be able to use headphones. They'd have to listen through the tablet speakers. So sounds in the medium to low range would not be heard over those speakers. So hence we ended up going with more acute and high-pitched sounds. Now once we had the Huxley sounds dialed in, we now had to tackle the giant flying whale. So let me bring the whale out to you. Switch over again. Oh, so many wires. I know, it's not like at the Consumer Electronics. I had to bring his little brother to MAGFest. Quite luxury. Backwards. That's all right. Oh no, I got it right side up. Okay, looks like he's heading home. Sometimes he likes to swim all around the room and I have to like chase him everywhere, but it looks like he's a bit sleepy today. All right, bye-bye, Leviathan. And one more switch.
Make sure you plug the audio cable in your MacBook this time.
It's a good tip. So our first and most critical objective was to make sure the audience could really connect with the whale and its immense power. And so we needed the sound to create a sense of scale and size. And some of what we had to do was quite straightforward. We used a lot of low frequencies. And in fact, we used so many low frequencies that we actually made the building shake. So when the whale was flying over people in that Intel's keynote, like building was going like this, and people were like, oh my God, the whale is like over me and I can feel it, which was pretty cool. Now, the other thing is we also needed the sounds of the giant ship. Wood creaking, tightening ropes, metal clanks, midshipmen, thunderclaps, wind, and so forth. But how do we go about creating this giant, genetically fabricated flying whale ship? Well, I thought, what about taking the sounds of flying dragons, slowing them way down, pitch shifting them down as well? I mean, dragons are these big flying beasts, although they tend to be fast flyers, perhaps taking their wing flaps and body movements. And as I said, slowing them down and pitching them down could be quite interesting. Maybe even adding some reverb as well to make the sounds even bigger. And the team loved this idea, and they gave me the go-ahead to experiment, and I was super thrilled. But then I realized, where are we going to find a dragon? So we've been on a wide-ranging journey today, and I'm certain that over the next few short years, successful game creators will push into new musical and new sonic territories and drive even deeper emotional resonance into their creations by beginning to focus on audio aesthetics, just as they've done in recent years by adopting some of the principles of visual aesthetics. And in order to achieve this, though, the audio leaders of tomorrow must develop a deep familiarity today with the foundations and principles of aesthetics. Just as film sound was pushed into a media language of its own, we will establish a common language for game audio aesthetics, and we need to keep growing that language. We must explore unorthodox paths, think outside the box. We'll continue to do research on sound and auditory perception in order to find new ways to use sound, new contexts where sound can be utilized, and new applications for sound in general. And we'll think about sound as a key component of gameplay, as we're starting to see with audio-centric and sonic adventure games such as Papa Sangre and Blindside, and terrific games like that. However, when sound and visuals work together towards the same goal, then there's a potential for a synergy greater than the component parts. What I want to leave you with is that gameplay must be designed for sound from the ground up. A great game experience is one that will totally immerse the player and one that starts with the involvement of sound planning at the very beginning of a project. With a healthy collaboration between game designer, sound designer, game producer, and composer, audio can really then further the artistic aims of the game, helping to establish and reinforce the core meaning and experience. And when game makers finally begin to take a holistic perspective on sound, considering the audio component of their games equally alongside all the elements that make up a gamer's experience, rather than just treating it as something to be heard, then I believe that sound and image will begin to collaborate fully with one another, taking full advantage of all opportunities. Thanks so much, everybody. I know it's 1 minute to 5:30, so I could take a couple of questions probably, and then when we have to get kicked out, I can always stand around and we can chat. Yes. Was your question, what program did I use to mix the sound with? You mean like what sort of workstation?
Like a DAW?
Like a digital audio workstation? We use Pro Tools. Yes. We used Pro Tools for the music, and then the sounds, it was a combination of doing Pro Tools and also Adobe Audition. Yes?
What do you think of games that people are working on now that use audio as the only means of expression?
You're talking about the Sonic Adventure games? You're talking about like the Papa Sangres, where like they have very little visuals? Is that what you're referring to?
No visuals.
Yeah. So for those of you in the room that may not be familiar, it's a relatively new movement of games where sound is the game, where basically you see through your ears. And these games use either limited visuals or no visuals whatsoever. And so the story is told through the sound, through audio cues and the sound. I think those games are fabulous. I love them, and I love, and a lot of my colleagues are like, it's finally our time to shine. And again, I think they're wonderful, but I also don't want it to be that the only way that audio gets its time in the sun is by having a solely audio adventure type game. And that's why, to me, the best thing is the audio-visual contract, when you can do something very expressive with audio and do it with visuals. The two together, I think the sum is greater than the individual parts. So I love those types of games. Absolutely, I think they're amazing. But I think that we've really got to keep focusing on doing really aesthetic stuff with audio, with just a traditional game. And one of the ones that I usually talk about that to me, it came out in 2010, but it's still a freaking masterpiece, is Limbo. Limbo is a beautiful piece of art, both visually and orally. And if you haven't checked it out, please do. It uses subjective character perception, it uses ambiguity. The whole idea is that they didn't want to intentionally manipulate the player, so they weren't, using like traditional music soundtracks, because music can manipulate folks. They wanted to leave things intentionally open to interpretation and multiple meanings. It's just, and also it uses subtlety and silence and minimalism. It's just incredible. So a lot of the aesthetic principles I talked about today, Limbo has all of those. And there's other ones. There's, Flower, Journey, Bastion did some very interesting things too. I'm really looking forward to Limbo's spiritual sequel called Inside. If you haven't checked out the trailer for Inside, holy cow, it's something else. But I could talk for hours about this stuff. Are there any other questions before we have to leave the room? Yeah.
Are there any books you recommend that further explain the aesthetics of audio design?
That's a great question. So there are a couple of books that I would actually recommend. One is to look at Michel Chion's L'Audiovision or Audiovision. That is the sound and image and sound and narrative like Bible, at least for film, but you apply that to games. And then David Sonnenschein has a book on sound design as well. I think it's something like The Expressive Power or something rather. And then, not to shamelessly plug this, but I'm actually working on my own book that dives into, a lot of these specifics and how we can bring, different types of aesthetic devices from that we didn't get to talk about today, like radio and opera and musique concrète and literature, and bring that into game audio design. So hopefully soon in the future, my own book. But those two are available now.
Okay, I will look them up. I will definitely take a look at those when I have the time.
Awesome. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you collaborating with anyone on the East Coast educationally as far as curriculums and stuff like that?
That's another really good question. So as I mentioned, I teach at USC, but I also run workshops and teach at other universities as well. So I actually, one of the other panelists here who's at American University, he's now talking to me about having me come and do a guest lecture. And then actually tomorrow I'm jumping on a plane to go see Berklee School of Music in Boston, because their whole thing is they teach a lot of technical sound design and really want to dive more into the aesthetics and storytelling devices. So I'd say there's always a possibility. If you're interested in taking a workshop with me, we do a lot of crazy unconventional labs. We make soundscapes and musical compositions from cardboard. We do all sorts of weird, wacky, mad scientist stuff. Please bring me your card so I can keep in contact with you of when I might be doing a workshop or speaking at a university in your area. Cool. Well, again, Any more questions? Yeah.
Do you find that horror games seem to understand the sound component a little bit better than some others?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Definitely, they tend to do a much better job. And I actually, in my longer talks, I go into the horror genre and talk about, juxtaposition. I go more into ambiguous sound and sort of, discordant vocalizations and timing and volume changes and stuff. So that's the thing. I mean, horror movies themselves are fantastic for sound and how they control a person's emotional response. So yes, definitely survival horror games are great. I would also look at even, has anyone ever played Year Walk? It's a mobile game from Simogo. It's a Swedish studio. And it's also horror, but it's not the same as, say, a Resident Evil or a Dead Space. It's not like a survival horror. It's not like this on-the-nose kind of thing. It's more this creepy, haunting, minimalistic type environment. If you've ever seen the movie Wicker Man, it just gets inside of you. And I love that. I love that there's different ways to explore horror too, that it doesn't just have to be the sort of the grisly creatures. But all of those games tend to do a good job, yes.